Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's Ask Andrew show, Canada's first Facebook live streaming family law question and answer show. My name is Andrew Feldstein, and I'm the principal of Greater Toronto Area family law firm Feldstein Family Law Group. Both myself and our entire firm practice exclusively in the area of family law, and we have offices in Markham, Vaughan, Oakville, and Mississauga. Today, we're talking about parenting post-separation. We have Michelle Hayes, the clinical director at Successful Families. Michelle is a registered social worker with more than 24 years of experience working with parents, adolescents, and children. She has a private practice located in Burlington, Ontario. She provides counseling, mediation, parenting plan assessments, voice of the child reports, reconciliation therapy, and parenting coordination. She is also a consultant for Catholic Children's Aid Society of Hamilton and the Children's Aid Society of Hamilton on high conflict cases involving children. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew.
So I want to start off because you obviously do a lot of things, and our show is focused on parenting post-separation. And could you tell our viewers how your clinic helps your clients with that? How do you make for successful families after they've separated?
Well, essentially, Successful Families offers multiple services, which includes counseling for individuals and families and couples. And so it's not only just post separation, but it's mental health issues, trauma, grief, relationship issues. And so, as part of Successful Families, one of the things that I do is I offer services to families that are post separation or divorce, and some of which are court involved. So, that can be anything from domestic violence and power imbalance screening, as you mentioned, mediation, parenting coordination, parenting plan evaluations, voice of the child reports, co-parenting counseling. All of this, though, focused for me in that practice around the best interests of children. So it's really trying to support families once the separation is about to occur, and trying to support them so that they can stay focused on children.
So I'm going to circle back to what the topic of today's show, which is parenting post separation. Doesn't mean we won't talk about other things, but I think of how many times we have our case and we're all jockeying for positions and trying to get our client the best deal that we can. And that starts post separation. And some people may come to you for assistance because they think it's good to help their case. But then there's also people who sign the separation agreement and really don't understand what it means to co-parent. So how do you deal with, one, the type of person who is in the middle of litigation or negotiation and they're coming to you to get help to learn how to do it better? Those are probably newer separated people, for lack of better words. And then people who may have their agreement and are coming to you and need help.
I really think that it's almost one and the same from a co-parenting perspective. And the reason is that co-parenting is this concept where I don't think we give it much thought when we're raising children together in a relationship. But then once separation occurs, there's this new dynamic. And each parent is essentially managing day to day decisions for the children. And then on top of that, the major decisions with respects to medical, religion, education. So the idea that post separation, this dynamic is now different, even if it's freshly separated or years have passed since the separation. The idea is that it's learning how to parent with the other parent, when you're not in the same physical living arrangement. So communication then becomes even more key to making decisions and placing children first. So parents need to really find a way to work with one another that focuses on the best interests of the child, and away from so that the child does not experience the conflict, whether it's initially right after the separation or years have gone by and there's conflict between the parents. And that results, of course, in efficient and ideally efficient and collaborative decisions on behalf of the child.
So I'm going to start with where I see the biggest problems in that dynamic occur with people post separation. And maybe it's a little bit of a stereotype, because in most cases, I shouldn't say most, but in a lot of cases, we see equal sharing of the children's time post separation. However, what I often hear is one spouse was really the decision maker for the doctor, the dentist, and they may have consulted, and the other spouse trusted them and said, sure. Now they separate, and the spouse that always got to make, in essence, make the decision when they were together struggles with the concept of going to the former spouse who now has very active input. And that sometimes creates significant conflict when they're not seeing things the same way. And I don't know if that's where you see a lot of the problems seem to stem from.
Certainly early on, there is a new definition of rules, I think, between parents, particularly in the scenario you just provided. The idea that one parent managed not only day to day at times, but also some of those major decision pieces. My role as the co parenting coach, or when parents are entering into that, is to understand the roles a little bit differently. So it's the idea that if I'm making decisions, but I'm not receiving any pushback from the other parent, or they essentially agree with the decisions I'm making, then really that is in essence co-parenting. Because if they fundamentally didn't agree with a decision that's being made, one would think that that other parent would then say, I don't think that our child should go to this school, or I don't think that they should see this particular doctor, or perhaps they don't need a specialist, or whatever the case may be. So really it's about working with parents in preparation in some ways to understand that new role, but also it's also to honor all of the work that's gone into raising children, right? So part of it is having that discussion with them, and especially if I have both parents with me, is spending some time just looking at sort of the new dynamic and what it looks like, and redefining for them maybe what co-parenting looked like while they were together, because that allows them then to see the new situation maybe through a different lens.
Now, one of the areas I see people often go in the wrong direction, and this is human nature, but I think it becomes harder when it's separated spouses, what you said earlier. You teach them how to communicate, because it's all too often, especially when you're communicating in writing, you mean one thing, but somebody reads what you said in a very different way. Or you may not have meant something to create conflict, but when someone receives it, they view it as accusatory, or they view it as in a very negative light. And how do you help people with the communication so that they can co-parent without, I think, offending the other side?
I don't know that there is for us, it's about looking at communication patterns. So really this is so skills based, right? So when we read an email, it's also understanding that communication, it's removing or learning the skill of removing some of the emotion and reading it more from a business framework. So what's being asked, what's being identified, and then focusing on how to respond. Now, some of that communication actually can be quite inflammatory and is meant to raise emotion in the other parent. And then the skills-based piece is really teaching them how to not give into it, how not to respond with conflictual behavior, or try to, again, respond in a business type way, so that the co-parenting stays at the heart of the conversation, and the child's best interest stays central to any communication that occurs, so that it does become more efficient. Oftentimes when I see people who come to me, they've engaged in that back and forth quite actively, maybe even for years. And the idea that there's such stress that is held by a parent waiting for emails to pop in or texts to show up, we ideally, when teaching these skills, then we allow parents to kind of be free from that. And there's suggestions of, preparing yourself for inflammatory emails. Maybe that means it's a different email account. that doesn't automatically deliver to your phone, or it won't pop up while you're at work or parenting the kids. So there's all of these different strategies that we put into place so that parents can really remain focused on that and hone their skills to respond.
I find it just interesting the way you put that, because that really is important. And I see how clients will react to that communication. And I remember one of my clients saying to me, I know I will always get that very negative email that's meant to raise conflict on the first day of my vacation. I say, every time. And I say, why do you open it? They say, because they feel compelled to. I say, well, A, maybe you shouldn't open it. B, the other thing to do is turn it into a game where you say to whoever it is you're going away with, providing this isn't just your kids, like if you have a new partner, when do you think I'll get the email? Do you think I'll get it before noon? Do you think I'll get it after, in the afternoon, and make lightweight of it so that it doesn't have that negative impact of stressing you out anymore. And then when it comes in, it's like, oh, here it is. Because it's about learning how, for different people, have different ways of being able to cope with these things. And it's learning to minimize the anger that it may bring out. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, because building on that, Andrew, is one of the strategies I will say to parents, that in terms of having an email account that they solely use for the purpose of co-parenting communication, one way, again, is to not be controlled by when that email pops into your inbox, but rather setting aside time to go and check that inbox. So saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to turn on my phone after I've gotten off the plane at the start of vacation, and bing, here comes the email that's perhaps really emotionally driven or negative. Rather than doing that, instead, let that go to somewhere else, and you tell yourself that at 6 p.m. or after dinner or once the kids go to bed, I'm going to purposely go into that email and I'm going to check to see if an email was sent, because that pattern predicts that it'll be there, but you've also sort of emotionally prepared yourself to open the email and respond in a different way. So it gives some more control in some ways, so that the person isn't you don't feel inflamed by the receipt of that.
I think that's very sound advice. You talked about keeping children out of conflict. And one of the hardest things, I think, for co-parents is at times they can't agree. At times they can't make a decision. And the challenge is twofold. One, going to court is horribly expensive. And it means, do you really take somebody to court because you want to save $300 by leaving a few hours earlier on a flight? And ways to resolve it, and whether you think going to a parenting coordinator is a good idea.
And that's such a good point, because sometimes it's about the management of the conflict itself, and really bringing into the attention of the parents, is this worth it? Is this child focused? Is this about you as a parent, or is it about the child in some way? And even if you win or you're right, really, what does that do for the child? Is it enhancing the relationship between parent and child? Is it just the win that you're looking for because, you need sort of validation that you were right? And realistically, it's the redirection or refocusing constantly on what does the child need to have happen for them so that they have a happy and healthy life. At the end of the day, my refocusing with parents is saying, would you ever be ashamed of any of the communication or behavior that you exhibited if your child did become aware of it in years to come, or if at age 25 they became aware or read emails or communication or heard phone calls? How would you feel about it at that time? So it really is just the idea of trying to draw things to make people more insightful and refocus them back on what this whole argument, if you will, is about, which is about the children. So do we need to be right, or do they need to be healthy?
Well, I think that draws into a really important point, which is often the dispute isn't about the dispute. It's really about control and power. What I often see is one person wants the control and power, whether they had it during the marriage and someone else now wants it, or somebody got it post-separation and the other person wants it back. And the decisions typically, like you say, are not driven by being child focused, but are driven by who wants control and power. And my question for you is, when you know that this is about control and power, like the example of a child being able to go on a vacation that
Right.
usually they're beneficial to the children, and the other parent trying to create roadblocks. How do you deal with that kind of conflict?
Well, ideally that before they get to the point of attempting to plan vacations, it's about that preparatory work that exists. Having those conversations and raising those things, those types of conflict that come into their purview as parents. For me, these are the types of examples, being a parenting coordinator or doing mediation, that I try to get ahead of. So I prepare them to understand that conflict is going to rise at periods. Sometimes it's convenient and sometimes it's not so convenient, but it's always predictable. There's patterns where even pre-separation, the parenting patterns that were set into place, the conflict resolution skills that they did or did not have, they will emerge again as post separation or divorce. So it's really about taking the knowledge that the parents have of one another and their relationship, and trying to determine the best way we can where the conflict may come from, what kinds of things might rise. And when I use previous case examples or the experience that I have and say, this might be an issue going forward at some point, some parents will say to me, well, no, I don't see that being an issue, or I don't think that's going to, that's not going to be raised by the other parent. And then they're surprised when it is, because experience tells us that after years working with families post separation, that these become issues for a variety of reasons. And maybe that reason is someone has a new partner in their life, or they've gotten a job promotion, they purchased a new home, they're going on vacation more than they used to. Like, there can be all kinds of reasons, but the prep, the pre-work that happens so that we really have a sense of calm and confidence in co-parenting is about that preparation and the ability to look into a crystal ball when one doesn't really exist.
I think your comment about preparation is really important, because it's helpful if people have realistic views of cases. Because I've had clients come in to me many times over the years saying, well, my spouse wants to take the children away on a vacation. And I go, well, is it their parenting time? Yes. And I go, well, what's the problem with it? And they're angry because the spouse is taking them on vacation and they're not. And in the eyes of a lawyer, it's really obvious. We know what the answer is going to be. They're going to get to go. But that doesn't stop people from saying, I'm not going to give you the passport. I'm not going to give you the travel consent that you need as the game, because they think, well, let them take me to court. And how many times I've had clients come in and say, I've lost 2 trips with my kids and I'm not going to do it the third time. This time I'm going to take them to court. And it's a real shame, because I think what I hear you doing about the preparation, to me, makes a lot of sense, because that's hopefully avoiding these people causing the children to miss out on the vacations with the family. Because that's sad. I always remember this a few years ago, I was supposed to take my son to see the Leafs in Detroit, Michigan for an outdoor game, and he got sick. First week he was going to go away with his mother, and then in the second week we were going to go to this hockey game, and he got sick, and him and his sister couldn't take their 1 week all-inclusive trip with their mother. And she said to me, can I move the trip back 2 or 3 days for when they're healthy to travel? And that meant I would lose taking my son to that one game. And I thought in my mind, well, both my kids want to go on the all-inclusive trip probably more than my son wants 3 hours at a hockey game. So I said, sure, take them. Because to me, maybe it's being a divorce lawyer, it was a rather obvious decision to make. And that's the kind of thing viewers need to understand is, if you ever end up in front of a court and you're saying no to a trip, you better have a really, really good reason to say no to a trip. And if you think that, especially with younger children, missing 4 or 5 days of school trumps getting a trip to Europe or some exciting events, it's not going to, because those are learning experiences as well that enrich a child. If you think trying to say it's unsafe for my child to go somewhere, you better have really good evidence. The government of Canada recommending it's not a safe place to travel was good evidence. If you're going to say you don't want the trip because you're worried your child's going to be abducted if your co-parent takes the child, you better have really good evidence of that. Because if the person has a good job here, if the person owns a home here, if the person has family here, the court's going to look at it and say, they're not going to be abducting this child. I mean, the best one I ever saw was I had a client, and her former spouse was in a same sex relationship, living with his current partner for, I think, 5 or 6 years. And she was worried that he was going to abduct the child by taking the child to China. And I looked at her and said, you want me to go to court and object to a trip over suggesting that this gentleman who is in a same sex relationship is going to want to live in China over Toronto? I said, that makes absolutely no sense to me. And if it makes no sense to me, it's going to make no sense to the court. And the message I'm trying to get to and why I'm focused on vacations is all too often, this is a real hot button issue that we see. And when I hear you saying doing the work, I think that's really critical. And like you said, what's the cause of the problem? What I often see is it's a new partner going on the trip. And the former spouse doesn't like the thought of their children going away on a vacation. And there's this new mom or new dad that's there and they're not there. There can be jealousy of the trip is the other one. I don't know about you, but are those the sort of common themes you see as what's really at the center of upsetting the party who's staying?
It often is, although it is encapsulated in this concept of, well, a child shouldn't miss X number of days of school, or, it's really about peeling back the layers of that onion and understanding the dynamics of the relationship itself. And part of that co-parenting piece is really identifying or recognizing behaviors that may cause more conflict or make life more difficult for children growing up between two homes. And our job is to make parents understand, we want them to understand the impact of that conflict itself and how that impacts child development and what kind of messaging that sends to a child. So I will ask questions similar to what you just raised, Andrew. I'll ask questions about, if you had an opportunity to take your child on this trip, would you take them? Did you travel while the two of you were in the relationship together? What did that look like? What were the reasons for the travel? Why did you take the children? Why didn't you leave them behind? Were you concerned about them missing school then? So some of those questions that we ask is merely just to try to draw some insight into the situation, because developmentally, this is the psychoeducation piece. Developmentally, I will say to parents, do you know what children gain from travel? They gain a lot. There's worldly knowledge that they will experience, cultural, differences, language differences, dietary differences, and that's a learning experience within itself. So, we really have to delve down. And again, I think some of the reality of how the court does see these issues, because they look at it from a very best interest lens. What is best for children, not as what is best for parents.
Well, it's exactly right that it's viewed really solely on what's in the best interest of the child. And one of the things, I'm going to shift over to the parenting coordinator for communication, the concept of a parenting coordinator. And for viewers that don't appreciate what it is, a parenting coordinator usually will try to mediate differences between the parents. And if they can't mediate the difference, they have arbitral powers to make a determination on certain issues that the parents have agreed to give to the parenting coordinator, which will not be significant decisions like the parenting schedule or decision making. Those would typically be reserved for the court. But what I often find is, and I don't know if you've seen this in your practice as well, is that when you're negotiating a separation agreement, you get down to the point of, okay, how are we going to manage disputes going forward? And sometimes you have cases where you recommend parenting coordinators on both sides say, it's a great idea, we're all for it. And then you have cases where one side wants it and the other side doesn't. And again, I'm going to be stereotypical here, but usually the one who doesn't want it for a reason. And that is, they plan on being obstinate when there's about decisions that they know will be too expensive to go to court. And it's about trying to massage that person in, if you're working with them before they've entered into their final deal, to buy into this concept. Because to me, it's really good to have a referee that can call balls or strikes on a very efficient way. So where I'm going with that is, one, I'd like you to say to our viewers, what it means and how you would function in a parenting coordinator capacity, and two, why it's often good for parents to agree to it.
Well, and the key piece of parenting coordination is the idea that once again, it's another dispute resolution person who's going to be focused on the needs of a child. That is at the heart of all of the work in family law when children are involved. So a parenting coordinator, their role is of course mediation, and to remain in that mediation um, sort of phase, working with parents to craft their own decisions for children rather than having decisions imposed upon them. So rather than arbitrating, rather than a court decision or an order, it's the idea that we believe that parents really know their children best. And so if they know their children best, then presumably they would make the best decisions for them. So that's the key of the work that we do. And the arbitration is something that, no parenting coordinator really wants to engage in because they would rather promote parental decision making than parenting coordination, delivering a binding arbitration. So, the focus is, again, the prep work, speaking to the parties of the parents about what the outcome looks like, what is going to happen, but it also promotes communication. It really is truly a dispute resolution. And we have to stay focused on the idea of resolution. And why do we want resolution? For the children, so that we can quell the conflict. So when I encourage parents to engage in parenting coordination, it's for all of those particular reasons, because that is the person who will remain very focused on the kids, ideally draw that to the parents' attention whenever necessary, and obviously deal with the conflict before it impacts the children. Hopefully that's something that happens on a more timely basis.
Well, to me, it's not just a more timely basis, so our viewers can understand. I take the example of a trip because that's the most common one that I see. You contact your lawyer, I want to take a vacation. My former spouse says no. Well, now all of a sudden we have to do court materials. We have to get a court time scheduled, which isn't easy, and get in front of a judge. There's a lot of hurdles. When you have a parenting coordinator, you have somebody like Michelle who you've hired. You may pay them for a few hours to help you first mediate it, but you're going to send an email. When do you have time? Then they're going to get a response, and you'll have a phone call probably coordinated or a Zoom conference coordinated within a week or two. And it's going to cost you a fraction because my hourly rate, I'm sure, is more expensive than Michelle's, and you sharing in the cost of Michelle's fees. So there's a real benefit to that from a financial perspective. There's a real benefit from having the mediated side of it. So each side has the opportunity to gain insight into what the logic of their position is or why it may be flawed. And then lastly, I think when people go through that mediation process, they do a lot of learning. Because I've had clients who've come to me and said, yeah, I learned the vacation's going to happen. I didn't think it was such a great idea, but I understand why now. And then lastly, if the decision does get imposed on them, it doesn't take many decisions being imposed for someone, maybe for the wrong reasons, but maybe learning the right lesson. And that changes the dynamic, because when people realize what's going to happen, whether they agree with it or not, they believe they know what this person views of the best interest of the child are going to be. It's still better if they're making that decision and doing it voluntarily than having to go through this whole process, because it's better for the dynamic of co-parenting, because now there's going to be less conflict. So there's a lot of good that happens, but the negatives that I usually end up seeing stems from the fact that people who are a little bit informed or learn at the time they're entering in the agreement, who really have a plan to be obstinate, so maybe a parenting coordinator isn't right because they'll never go along with it, don't want that efficiency. And that's one problem that I wish the courts actually made orders directing people to go to a parenting coordinator for certain issues, because that would allow those issues to be addressed in what I view as a proper fashion, an expedient fashion, a cost-effective fashion, which is much better for families, rather than letting the conflict just fester over and over and over again. And sometimes that small conflict that starts out here, you wait 3, 4, 5 years of co-parenting, now it's up here and everything is back and forth. So it's a really good chance that people need to understand, because I know we're almost out of time, to appreciate that somebody like Michelle can take what is a little problem, solve it at the beginning, give you the tools to use at the beginning so it never turns into a high conflict case. So I can't urge our viewers enough to be open to the option of counseling to learn how to co-parent, to having parenting coordination, to going to individual counseling to gain the insight you need in separation. All of these kind of tools are really helpful. And there's going to be winners from this. The most important winners are going to be your children, because if you can co-parent better, your children are better winners. You're going to be a better winner from doing it because you're going to have less conflict in your life. And that means you're going to have a happier life, a better life. And the less you see me or people who do what I do, the better your pocketbook will be and the less stress you're going to have in your life. So I think we're out of time right now. And I wanted to thank you for joining us today, Michelle. We appreciate your time. The next Ask Andrew show is going to be on April 14th at 12 noon. If you have any questions or ideas for future shows, please email them to us at info@feldsteinfamilylaw.com. And thank you for watching.